Hi, class. It's Dr. Lindner. Welcome. And in this video, what we're going to be looking at is the introduction to anatomy and physiology. So when we talk about A&P, anatomy and physiology, let's take a look at what these mean. When we talk about anatomy, we're talking about structure. When we talk about physiology, we're talking about function. So A&P is really the study of human structure and human function, and they're both equally important. We say that structure determines function, and that's why we do dissections. That's why we look at cadavers, because when we look at the way something is structured, like maybe a shoulder joint, for example, or a hip joint, when we look at a shoulder or a hip joint, we see that it's like a ball and socket, like a ball and socket type of articulation, compared to maybe an elbow or a knee that's more like a hinge joint. And a hinge joint, like a door that's attached to hinges, only opens and closes, like a knee joint can flex and extend. But a shoulder joint and a hip joint can move in a wide variety of directions because of the shape or the structure of that joint. And when we talk about physiology or function, it's not just how things move, but we'll understand how, let's say, a muscle contracts. How does a muscle know to shorten or to lengthen? And we'll go over that function or the physiology. So structure determines function, A&P, anatomy and physiology. And we can look at anatomy through dissection, through cadaver, x-rays, MRIs, CAT scans, ultrasounds, any type of diagnostic imaging is another way of looking at structure. When we look at function, well, how are things functioning? We could look at labs, we could look at blood work, tell us a lot about liver functioning and kidney functioning and how muscles are functioning. If we look at EKGs or EEGs, we can look at brain waves and heart waves to determine how they're functioning as well. So there's different ways of looking at function. Now, when we look at anatomy, there's microscopic and macroscopic anatomy. Microscopic needs a microscope, but macroscopic doesn't. So when we're talking about microscopic anatomy, this is when we're looking at things that you cannot see with the naked eye. You need a microscope, like looking at the cells or the molecules that make something up. When we study the cell, we refer to that as cytology. Anytime we see the word cyte or CYT, it refers to the cell. But whenever we bring a bunch of cells together and we connect cells, we can connect cells through different types of what we refer to as cell junctions. When cells come together through cell junctions, when they're held tightly together or they're interlinked together, they make tissues. And when we study tissues, we refer to that as histology. So study of cells or cytology, and the study of tissues is histology. What makes up tissues? A bunch of cells of similar function that are linking up together through cell junctions. Now, in a following week, we will look much closer at the 4 different types of tissues. We're going to focus a lot of time on epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. Those are the 4 types of tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nerve. We will spend another week on being able to identify all 4 of these and talk about structure and function. Now, you heard me say before in a previous slide, you heard me say that when a bunch of cells come together, they make tissues. But what are cells made up of? Well, cells are made up of chemicals. So when your chemistry comes together, maybe our atoms like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, maybe when these atoms come together, right? And if we think of chemistry, I think of biochemistry. When I think of biochemistry, I think of our food, I think of diet, and I think of carbohydrates, I think of fats, and I think of proteins. But all these things are, whether they're carbs, fats, or proteins, is a bunch of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, and how they are arranged. Again, how they are arranged is referring to structure, and structure determines function. So chemicals, that's why we need a good balanced diet of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, because when you study the cell this week and you look at what we call the cell membrane, when you study the cell membrane, which is really, if this is, let's say, the nucleus of the cell, and then we put the cell wall or cell membrane around it, it's a double layer. It's two layers. It's a double layer, what we call a phospholipid or a phospholipid bilayer, meaning it's two layers. And if we were to cut out just the section of this, we would see that it's made up of carbs, fats, proteins. So you need to have a good balance of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Good balanced chemical level means your cells are also healthy. And if your cells are healthy, when they come together, they make tissues, and they're healthy. Then when a bunch of tissues come together, they make an organ. In this case, this looks like the stomach. And what's cool about the stomach is, look, it's made up of epithelium. It's made up of connective tissue. It's made up of muscle. So what we said over here on this slide is that there's 4 types of tissues, and we can see that the stomach is made up of these 3 alone. Okay, so tissues come together to make an organ. This is the stomach. And when the stomach, which is an organ, comes together with other organs of similar function, like the pancreas, the small intestine, when organs come together that work in harmony together, they produce a system. In this case, the digestive system. And then the digestive system, with all the other systems, there are 11 altogether, all of those systems come together to make the crowning creation of all called the organism. So again, the levels of structural organization, we have chemicals or chemistry come together to make cells, cells come together to make tissues, tissues come together to make organs, the organs come together to make the systems like digestive system, respiratory system, immune system, musculoskeletal system, integumentary system, reproductive system, respiratory system. We have so many different systems, cardiovascular system, and all the systems come together to make the organism. And good structure makes good function. If there's damage to the chemistry, let's say the person drinks too much alcohol, they take drugs, they're smoking, they have a poor lifestyle, you can damage these bonds and you could get damaged at the chemical level. And if the chemicals are off balance, then guess what happens to the cells? They become off balance, which means the tissues become off balanced, and the organisms don't the organs don't function well, and then the systems malfunction. And when systems malfunction due to everything downstream malfunctioning, malfunction is disease. That's a disease process. Okay, so good place to take our first break. When we come back, we'll get into some of the systems.